Now, the other day I was reading the first issue of a new ongoing Star Wars comic series called Han, Solo, and Chewbacca, a series set a few years before the events of A New Hope, where basically Han is teaming up with Greedo to steal the ashes of a former enemy of Jabba's from some rich guy on Corellia, which is of course Han's homeworld. And while they're while in a bar or cantina on the planet and trying to figure out their next step, Han runs into someone, or someone runs into Han rather, who works at the Corellian Engineering Corporation, or CEC, which both happens to be the company the rich guy with the ashes is the CEO of, and is also where Han's father used to work building YT-1300 freighters, which, yes, is the same model number as the Millennium Falcon. Anyway, as contrived as this probably already sounds, it turns out, after this guy and Han get to talking for a bit, that this is, or so he claims to be, that it's Han's father, and that he's apparently been looking for Han for all these years, but the issue ends before we can learn any more than that or get any of it confirmed, which, yeah, is a standard kind of comic book tactic to end your book to get people to buy the next issue. However, before we start to really wonder or discuss if this actually is Han Solo's father, for whatever that's worth, earlier in the issue, some mystery character was shown being made aware of the fact that Jabba was paying 1,000,000 credits for this urn with his enemy's ashes in it. And this mystery character then, no surprise, took an interest and asked if anyone else was after the urn. The mystery character was then told Han Solo was hired by Jabba and was asked if he knew who that was, and it was left ominously unanswered if the mystery character knew or not. Which basically means, or so I would guess, that this mystery character does indeed know a thing or two about Han Solo, or looked into him and learned all he could, and is now posing as his long-lost father in order to eventually double-cross Han in order to be the one who collects 1,000,000 credits. It could also be that Greedo will double-cross Han as well, or side with the fake father for some reason. We can guess this because after Han agrees to work with Greedo, he threatens to shoot first and ask questions later should Greedo happen to double-cross him, which I guess will add something to the classic scene in A New Hope when Han does indeed kill him by further explaining or justifying it or something. Or maybe it's just meant as nothing more than a nod to the whole who shot first, even though originally, or in the original cut of the film, Greedo never shot at all. But anyway, and not to get into that whole debate, and this isn't meant as a slight against the writer or anything, and more on all that in a bit, but this comic book really did a good job of reminding me of why I loved, or still love, the books and comics of the old expanded universe, why I miss new material from it so much, and why its cancellation continues to baffle me all these years later. As well as reminding me why reading material from the new canon, reading the books and comics from it, is oftentimes, but not always mind you, there are diamonds in the rough for sure, but why it's oftentimes so very frustrating or even borderline pointless. Which is because, once upon a time, the books and comics of the expanded universe were the story. They were more or less the only sources of new Star Wars content, and where literally everything, big and small alike, happened. They were also written by Star Wars fans, or authors who were clearly big Star Wars fans, for other huge fans of Star Wars. They knew their audience. They knew your average person or very casual fan was unlikely to randomly pick up a Star Wars book or comic and start reading and magically become a fan. And if they did, if they picked up a book, it was probably because they already had a keen interest in getting into Star Wars or getting more into it, and would accept that there might be, shall we say, a bit of a learning curve to understanding the greater universe and story. That what they were starting to read might be part of a much greater, longer, and in-depth ongoing story that required knowledge of previous parts or previous stories altogether, or that there might be new characters or concepts or ideas not explored at all in the films that they'd be introduced to and that the stories would revolve around them. Over its many long years, the expanded universe truly took on a life of its own. It became its own thing, almost entirely independent of the films, you could even say. But nowadays, with the new canon books and comics, it's all too often filler material meant to try and complement or expand upon or fill in holes left by what the shows or movies are doing or have done. However, with a few exceptions, these stories usually don't really have any bearing on or a meaningful connection to those other bigger and more important stories. Which then leaves all these books and comics in this almost awkward limbo state where they're neither, again, truly relevant to the films and shows they're quote-unquote connected to, nor are they their own thing or own unique stories like the EU once had, where you can expect something interesting to happen or take place because we've either already seen the movie or show they're connected to and know what happens there, and hence the limit of what can happen in this book or comic we're reading, or we know nothing all too big will be revealed until the movie or show, which is the main event, if you will. The other rather similar problem many of these new books and comics face is being set in a very well-known and established time period, or being set between two very well-known stories where we know not much can really happen to the characters or with the overall story. An example of this would be the first volume of the mainline Star Wars comics for Marvel, set in the 3-year gap between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back. A time period that, sure, has room for maybe a couple meaningful adventures to be had for our main heroes, for Luke, Han, Leia, and so on, but not dozens of them where they're constantly facing life or death situations they narrowly escape from, or being constantly captured and then getting away from Vader and the Empire, because we of course know they will get away. There's not much tension because we know all roads for our heroes in this time period have to lead to the start of Empire Strikes Back on Hoth, which is another sort of problem for the new canon in the post-Return of the Jedi time period, that all roads, almost certainly, will lead to the sequel trilogy, to a well-known and established endpoint that the post-Return of the Jedi stories in the expanded universe didn't have to worry about or eventually line up with. And no coincidence, some of the best stories in the EU took place post-Return of the Jedi. But again, the EU was always telling and driving the story with the books and comics, not approaching some sort of definitive endpoint that they had to align with, not trying to fit stories within boundaries set by important parts or more important parts of the stories that the films and series were doing. They weren't regulated to just being used as filler information. And I say this as someone who, in general, doesn't mind that sort of thing, or who doesn't mind and actually likes the more, shall we say, frivolous world building, who actually enjoys, for whatever reason, learning the trivial facts or details about Star Wars characters, places, events, and so on. That's okay with reading a small story from time to time about a character that doesn't necessarily have to have deeper meaning or implications for the galaxy. But the thing is, the expanded universe used to actually do both of those things at the same time. Those stories would give me fun little details, those little nuggets or tidbits of information that filled out the world's or galaxy's details, along with, creating new characters and really good and meaningful stories for them and old alike. They usually felt like a full and complete experience. Not something that just takes a character like Han Solo and uses them for a gimmick story about finding his father that almost certainly won't end up being his father in the end, or like they did a few years ago in the comics where they made a big deal out of introducing Han Solo's first wife, Sana, only for her to not actually be his wife. Or when, and this was probably the biggest thing done in a new canon comic book, they heavily implied in a Vader comic book that Palpatine had influenced the creation or birth of Anakin, only to quickly backtrack and say that's not what they were trying to imply at all, or that's only what the vision suggested, but not actually how it all went down, because we can't let something that interesting and actually important to the story be revealed in a comic book, not when that could be maybe saved for a movie some year down the road. And like I was saying before, I don't exactly blame the writers of the books and comics, nor am I saying none of them are ever enjoyable or worth reading. Again, there are absolutely some diamonds in the rough here. There are good stories in the new canon books and comics. There's some really good ones, or that they still manage to be enjoyable despite the limitations they no doubt face while writing them. That they're not allowed to do anything major, that they have these restrictions when it comes to what they can do because they are not the main event driving the story. They exist more to build to those main events in their own small little ways. And I do feel like most new canon writers, try to do the best they can with what little they have to work with, or whatever limitations and stipulations are placed upon them from the start, keeping in mind they don't have anywhere near approaching the freedom they clearly had back in the day of the EU, where again, the books and comics, they were the story, they were where things were constantly moving forward. But today in the books and comics, it's almost like these writers are being asked to tread water with these characters, or to pretend or give the illusion they're doing something with them, but they can't actually move them forward or backwards. They have to keep them in place, but make it interesting somehow. And just like with actually treading water, it's not necessarily easy to continually do it, as it's also not very interesting to watch someone tread water, or in this case, not always exciting to read content produced about a character just for the sake of producing content about a character in order to sell. And as I've said before, which isn't to say I like it, but I do understand why Disney decided not to go with the expanded universe when they took over and started making new films. I do get not wanting to beholden yourself to all that content, decades of content, especially when there are certainly inconsistencies and some dud stories in there as well. Let's be honest and fair here, the expanded universe wasn't perfect. Not to mention, no, it was never recognized by George Lucas as part of his official canon. He always thought of it as something separate from his version of Star Wars, which actually wasn't necessarily a bad thing when you really stop and think about it, because that allowed it to truly become its own unique version of Star Wars that ran, you could say, sort of parallel to Lucas's version or his films, brought to us by people who loved what Lucas was doing or had done and wanted to honor that, made for people who also very much loved Star Wars. Which is maybe the oddest part of all when it comes to canceling it, because not only was it already its own unique and separate thing, separate from Lucas Star Wars, though obviously heavily based off of it, but let's be real here, it was something for the more dedicated fan. As I was saying earlier in this video, the books and comics in general are not picked up by the average person or casual fan. They're for those who really want to get into Star Wars, who will devote, in the case of a novel, hours upon hours to reading a story. And yet, one of the very first decisions Disney made with Star Wars was to anger those very dedicated and passionate fans, to cancel what had kept some of them around the franchise for decades, or kept them vested in Star Wars between the trilogies, which, from their point of view, also meant they were the ones, the fans, who were spending money on it when others had let it drift to the back of their mind and really stopped caring. And they would have continued to spend money on the expanded universe if they just kept cranking out more and more books and comics for them to enjoy. But for some reason, and I honestly cannot figure out why, they didn't. They canceled it, which might, I guess, make sense if they didn't want to get books and comics from the expanded universe confused with the books and comics set in the new canon, or if they didn't want to confuse fans about what is or isn't part of the new canon. However, there's not only a simple solution to that problem, but they already use it. They literally reprint all the old expanded universe books and slap a Legends logo on them. So what's the difference between reprinting all those old books and putting a label on them, and printing new books and putting that same label on them? In closing here, as I've been saying, it's not that every book and comic in the new canon is garbage. Some of them are really good and enjoyable, and I'd be interested in making a list of them if people are interested in such a video. But it's that the writers are, I think, clearly hamstrung with what they can and cannot do. And too often, they're relegated to just creating supplementary material or dealing with characters in a time and place where nothing really relevant can happen to them. We also have the problem of books and comics either being ignored by the shows and movies or just flat out retconned by them when it's convenient. And we're very likely to get another example of that with the Kenobi series, because they have a handful of comic books set at roughly the exact same time that this show is going to take place, and they're almost certainly going to get ignored by this new show. And for fun, perhaps I'll do a video going into what those comics actually covered, what they suggested Obi-Wan was up to at this time, as well as maybe covering the book simply called Kenobi from the EU that also dealt with this time period, and comparing how both have handled it, or how the series will eventually handle it, compared to how this book did. And yes, I still do want to do my own version of the Kenobi series as well, and more on that real soon. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me, do you read the new canon books and comics? And if you do you enjoy them? Did you used to read the old expanded universe? And how do you think they compare against them? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.